The desert wind carried nothing but dust and broken promises through the streets of Redemption Creek. It was a town that wore its name like a cruel joke, for there was precious little redemption to be found among its sun-bleached wooden buildings and hard-faced inhabitants. The year was 1887, and the Texas frontier had a way of stripping away everything soft from a place, leaving only the bones of human nature exposed to the merciless sun. Grace Whitman stood at the window of the parsonage, watching tumbleweeds roll past the weathered church next door. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that seemed almost defiant in such harsh surroundings: auburn hair that caught the light like copper, eyes the color of sage honey, and a complexion that somehow remained fair despite the brutal sun. But it was her hands that told the real story of who she was: calloused from washing clothes for the sick, stained from preparing meals for the hungry, scarred from mending everything that could be mended in a town where nothing stayed whole for long. Her father, Reverend Josiah Whitman, was in his study, preparing Sunday's sermon. She could hear the scratch of his pen against paper, the occasional clearing of his throat. He was a man who believed in the power of God's word to transform even the most stubborn hearts, though Grace sometimes wondered if he'd ever truly looked into the eyes of their congregation and seen what lurked there. "Grace, Mrs." Holloway's shrill voice cut through the afternoon heat. "Grace Whitman!" Grace opened the door to find the banker's wife standing on their porch, her face flushed with more than just the heat. Behind her stood several other women from the church, their expressions a mixture of scandal and barely concealed excitement. "Mrs. Holloway," Grace said, stepping aside. "Please, come in from the heat." But the woman remained on the porch, her thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. "We won't be entering this house," she declared, loud enough for passers-by to hear. "Not until certain matters are addressed." Grace felt her stomach tighten. "I don't understand. Don't you play innocent with us, Missy?" This from Mrs. Carlton, the shopkeeper's wife. "We know what you've been doing. Sneaking around at night, meeting with that Mexican boy from the stables." The blood drained from Grace's face. "Miguel? I was tending to his mother. She's been ill with fever." "At midnight, Mrs." Holloway's voice dripped with accusation. "Alone? We have witnesses who saw you leaving his quarters well past any decent hour." "His mother was dying." Grace's voice rose despite herself. "I couldn't just leave her. And where was the boy while you were tending to his mother?" "Mrs." Carlton stepped forward, her eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "In the same room, wasn't he? The same bed, some say?" The words hit Grace like a physical blow. "He was holding her hand. She was frightened, calling for him in Spanish. I couldn't—" "Enough, Mrs." Holloway raised a gloved hand. "Your father will hear of this disgrace, the daughter of a minister, carrying on with a stable boy, and a Mexican at that." The women turned and swept away in a rustle of petticoats and righteous indignation, leaving Grace standing in the doorway, her hands trembling. She knew how quickly gossip spread in Redemption Creek, how a whisper at noon could become a shout by sunset. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. Within an hour, Reverend Whitman emerged from his study, his face carved from stone. Behind him stood three of the church elders, Mr. Holloway, Judge Patterson, and Samuel Mills, the town's self-appointed moral guardian. "Grace?" her father said, and she heard her doom in the way he spoke her name. "These men have brought serious accusations against you." "Father, please let me explain." "Silence." The word cracked like a whip. "Is it true you were seen leaving the Mexican quarters after midnight?" "Yes, but—" "Alone with a young man?" "His mother was dying. I was—" Judge Patterson stepped forward, his gray beard bristling with authority. "The appearance of impropriety is as damaging as the act itself. Young woman, you have brought shame upon this house of God." Grace looked desperately at her father, searching for some sign of the man who had taught her about compassion and mercy. But Josiah Whitman had retreated behind his ministerial facade, trapped between his daughter and his congregation. "The boy," Samuel Mills said with obvious disgust, "has already been run out of town, caught trying to steal from the general store. no doubt to fund his escape with you." "That's a lie," Grace cried. "Miguel would never—" "Enough!" her father's voice thundered through the small room. "You will go to your room and pray for forgiveness. The elders and I must discuss what's to be done." Grace climbed the stairs on leaden feet, each step taking her further from the life she'd known. Through her bedroom window, she could see the townspeople gathering in small groups, their faces turned toward the parsonage, hungry for scandal. The verdict came at sunset. Her father stood in her doorway, unable to meet her eyes. Behind him, she could hear the murmur of voices from below. Half the town had gathered to witness her judgment. "The elders have decided," Josiah said, his voice hollow. "You have brought disgrace upon this family and this church. Your presence here endangers my ministry and the spiritual welfare of this community. Father, please, you will leave Redemption Creek tonight." The words fell like stones. "Take only what you can carry. May God have mercy on your soul, for I can offer you none." Grace stared at him, this man who had raised her, who had preached about the prodigal son and the woman at the well. "You're casting me out? Your own daughter? You are no daughter of mine." The words seemed to cost him, but he spoke them nonetheless. A woman who would compromise her virtue, who would shame her father's name. "You're dead to me." He turned and left, closing the door with a finality that echoed through her bones. Grace sank onto her bed, too shocked even for tears. Through the thin walls, she could hear the crowd outside growing larger, their voices rising in anticipation. She packed by lamplight, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a photograph of her parents from happier days, what little money she had saved from her sewing work. Her hands moved mechanically while her mind reeled. Miguel and his mother had vanished, run out of town or worse. And she was to follow, branded with a scarlet letter that existed only in the minds of those who had condemned her. When she descended the stairs, the front door stood open. The townspeople had formed a gauntlet from the porch to the street, their faces masks of righteous fury in the torchlight. Her father stood on the porch, his back to her, addressing the crowd about the wages of sin and the need for spiritual purity. Grace stepped into the night. The first stone caught her shoulder, the second, her cheek. She didn't run. She walked through the hail of pebbles and insults, her head high even as blood trickled from a cut above her eye. "Jezebel, harlot, Mexican's woman." The words followed her past the church where she'd been baptized, past the school where she'd learned her letters, past the cemetery where her mother lay, at the town's edge, where the buildings gave way to endless desert. She turned back once. Redemption Creek glowed with torchlight, a beacon of hypocrisy in the darkness. Then she faced the wilderness and began to walk. Behind her, the sound of hymns rose from the church, her father's congregation celebrating their purification. Ahead lay only darkness, coyote song, and the vast indifference of the desert. Grace Whitman, the preacher's daughter who had never harmed a soul, who had spent her life serving others, disappeared into the night carrying nothing but the weight of false accusation and a broken heart. The desert swallowed her whole, just as it had swallowed countless other souls who had dared to show mercy in a merciless land. The sun rose like a curse over the Badlands, turning the sky the color of dried blood. Grace had been walking for 2 days, her water nearly gone, her feet bleeding through the thin soles of her boots. The desert had no mercy for the unprepared, and she had left Redemption Creek with little more than heartbreak and the clothes on her back. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw with thirst. The landscape stretched endlessly before her, red rock formations twisted by ancient winds, sparse clusters of prickly pear cactus, and the occasional bleached bones of cattle that had wandered too far from water. She'd tried to follow what might have been a trail, but the wind had long since erased any sign of human passage. By the 3rd day, hallucinations began. She saw her mother walking beside her, cool and untouched by the heat. She heard Miguel's voice calling from behind the rocks, though when she turned, there was only silence and shimmer of heat waves. Her father appeared at noon, standing atop a distant mesa, but when she blinked, he became a twisted juniper tree, its branches reaching toward a pitiless sky. The buzzards found her on the fourth day. They circled overhead, patient as death itself, their shadows passing over her like dark blessings. Grace stumbled into a narrow canyon, seeking shade, and found instead a trap-steep walls on either side. No water, no way forward but a treacherous climb she no longer had strength to attempt. She collapsed against a boulder, her back to the stone, and watched the buzzards descend to nearby rocks. They studied her with intelligent eyes, occasionally spreading their wings to catch the thermal currents. Grace found herself laughing, a dry, cracked sound that frightened even her. "At least someone wants my company," she whispered to the birds. That's when she heard the horses. The sound echoed off the canyon walls. Hoofbeats, the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs. Grace tried to call out, but her voice was gone, stolen by thirst and desert wind. She could only wait, pressed against her rock. As the sounds grew closer, 3 riders appeared at the canyon mouth. The 2 in front were rough men, unshaven and dust-covered, with the look of those who lived outside the law. But it was the 3rd rider who drew her fading attention. He sat his horse like he was born to it, tall and lean, dressed in black despite the heat. A day's growth of beard shadowed his jaw, and his hat was pulled low. But she could see his eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, scanning the canyon with the alertness of a man who'd learned to see danger in every shadow. "Well, well," one of the front riders said, spotting her. "Look what we got here, boys. A little desert flower, wilted but still pretty." The second man dismounted, approaching her with a gap-toothed grin. "What's a lady doing out here all alone? You lost... Sweetheart?" Grace tried to speak, managed only a croak. The man laughed, reaching for her. But suddenly the 3rd rider was there, his horse between them. "Leave her be, Carson." The voice was low, controlled, but it carried an edge that made Carson step back. "Come on, Jake." Carson protested. "We found her fair and square. Been a long time since we seen a woman this pretty. I said leave her be." Jake Thornton swung down from his horse with fluid grace. "Get back on your horse. You getting soft on us?" the other rider called. "Time was... Jake Thornton would have... Time was... I did a lot of things." Jake knelt beside Grace, his expression unreadable. "That time's past. Now get out of here. Both of you. You can't just..." Jake's hand moved to his gun. Didn't draw it, just rested there. I am. You boys want to ride with me. You follow my rules. You don't like it. There's the trail." The 2 men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. "Finally." Carson spat in the dust. "This ain't over, Thornton. You've been going soft ever since Tucson. The boys won't stand for it much longer." They mounted and rode off, their curses echoing off the canyon walls. Jake watched them go before turning back to Grace. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. This was a man who'd lived hard and survived harder. "Can you understand me?" he asked. Grace nodded weakly. "I'm going to give you water, just a little at first." He uncapped his canteen, lifted her head gently. "Easy now. Too much too fast will kill you sure as thirst." The water was warm, tasting of metal and leather, but it was life itself trickling down her throat. She wanted to gulp, to drown in it, but he controlled the flow, patient as a mother with a child. "That's enough for now." He studied her torn dress, her bleeding feet. "You're the preacher's daughter, from Redemption Creek." It wasn't a question. Grace's eyes widened. "News travels fast out here," Jake said. "Especially news about a good woman supposedly gone bad. Though looking at you, I'd say the story got twisted some in the telling." He gave her more water, then opened his saddlebags and produced a strip of jerked beef. "Chew on this, slow-like." While she ate, he tended to her feet, cleaning the cuts with whiskey that made her gasp, wrapping them in strips torn from a relatively clean shirt. His hands were gentle, at odds with their scarred and calloused appearance. "Why?" Grace finally managed to whisper. "Why what? Why help you?" Jake sat back on his heels. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be judged by folks who don't know the whole truth." Maybe because leaving you here would be murder, and I've got enough blood on my hands. Or maybe—" He stood, looking down at her with those storm-gray eyes. "Maybe because I rode through Redemption Creek 2 weeks ago, saw you tending to that Mexican woman, bringing her soup, sitting with her through the night while her boy worked to pay the doctor. Didn't look like sin to me, looked like mercy." Tears leaked from Grace's eyes, the first she'd shed since leaving town. "You saw?" "I see a lot of things folks think are hidden." He moved to his horse, pulled down a blanket. "Sun's getting low. Canyon's a bad place to camp, too easy to get trapped, but you're in no shape to ride. We'll rest here tonight. Move at first light." "We?" Grace's voice was getting stronger. "Unless you got somewhere else to be." There was dry humor in his voice. "Way I figure, you got 3 choices. I leave you here. You're dead by morning. I take you to the nearest town. You're either dead or wishing you were once folks hear your story. Or—" He spread the blanket in the shade. "You come with me for a while. I can't promise it'll be safe or easy, but I can promise you'll be alive, and nobody'll lay a hand on you while you're under my protection." Grace knew she should be afraid. This man was Jake Thornton. She'd heard the name whispered in Redemption Creek. Bank robber, gunfighter, killer. Yet here he was, offering her water and kindness when her own father had cast her out. "I don't even know you," she said. "No," Jake agreed, checking his rifle. "But you know those good folks in Redemption Creek. How'd that work out for you?" The truth of it stung. Grace looked at the canyon walls, at the circling buzzards, at the empty trail the other outlaws had taken. Then she looked at Jake Thornton, outlaw and savior, standing guard as the desert prepared for night. "All right," she whispered. "I'll come with you." He nodded, as if he'd expected no other answer. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we ride hard. Carson and Boyd won't stay gone long, and there's others who'll be looking for both of us." As darkness fell over the canyon, Grace curled into the blanket that smelled of horse and gunpowder and something indefinably male. Jake sat with his back to a rock, rifle across his knees, watching the stars emerge in the deepening sky. "Mr. Thornton?" Grace called softly. "Jake," he corrected. "Just Jake. Why did you really help me?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Maybe because I'm tired of seeing the world crush the gentle ones. Maybe because I'd like to do one thing right before my past catches up with me." He shifted slightly, and starlight caught the planes of his face. "Or maybe because when I saw you in that town, bringing soup to a dying woman everybody else ignored, I thought, there goes someone the world hasn't broken yet. Be ashamed to let it start now." Grace closed her eyes, feeling safer in the company of this dangerous man than she'd ever felt in her father's house. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new uncertainties, but tonight she was alive, and someone thought her worth saving. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Jake Thornton kept watch, guardian and outlaw both, while the preacher's daughter slept. They rode through landscapes that changed like chapters in a book of trials. First came the alkali flats, where the ground cracked like broken promises and the air tasted of salt and despair. Jake had given Grace his spare shirt and an old hat to protect her from the sun, and she rode behind him on his horse, arms wrapped tentatively around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through the dust-covered fabric. On the second day, they entered a maze of slot canyons where flash floods had carved the rock into fantastic shapes. Jake navigated with the certainty of a man who'd used these hidden paths before, always alert, always watching their back trail. "Carson and Boyd will have reached the gang by now," he said during one of their brief rests. "They'll be coming." "Your gang?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not mine anymore." Jake's voice was flat. "Haven't been for a while now. Just took them time to notice." They pushed on through country that would have killed Grace alone, across lava fields where the black rock radiated heat like an oven, through forests of Joshua trees that looked like twisted prophets preaching to an empty sky. Jake knew every hidden spring, every cave that offered shelter, every trail that would confuse pursuers. It was at Skeleton Springs where everything changed. They'd stop to water the horse and refill their canteens when they heard it, a child crying. Jake's hand went immediately to his gun, but Grace was already moving toward the sound. "Wait," Jake hissed, but she didn't listen. Behind a cluster of boulders, they found them. An old Mexican man, barely conscious, and a boy of maybe 6 years, tears cutting channels through the dirt on his face. Their wagon lay on its side nearby, one wheel shattered, their mule dead in its traces. "Please," the boy said in accented English. "My grandfather. He is sick, very sick." Grace knelt beside the old man, feeling his forehead, burning with fever. She looked up at Jake, who stood watching with an unreadable expression. "We have to help them." "No, we don't." His voice was hard. "We can't take them with us. It'll slow us down, make us easier to track. Then we stay until—" "Grace." The way he said her name stopped her. "You don't understand. Carson's bringing at least a dozen men. They catch us. You know what happens to you. And them." He nodded at the boy. "Better they take their chances here than die with us." The boy understood enough. Fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "Please, senor, we have nowhere to go. The wagon, it is broken. My grandfather." Grace stood slowly, facing Jake. "You saved me when you didn't have to." That was different. "How?" Jake's jaw tightened. "It just was." They stared at each other across the desert silence. Grace saw the war in his eyes, survival instinct battling against something else, something he'd buried deep but hadn't quite killed. Finally. Jake cursed under his breath and knelt beside the old man. "What's wrong with him?" "Fever," Grace said. "From an infected wound. Looks like—" She'd found a deep cut on the man's leg, swollen and angry. "It needs cleaning, fresh bandages." "We don't have time for this." But even as he spoke, Jake was pulling supplies from his saddlebags. "Boy, what's your name?" "Pablo, senor. Can you ride?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Good. You'll ride with Grace, your grandfather." Jake studied the unconscious man. "I'll rig a travois. It'll slow us down, but not as much as trying to carry him." They worked quickly. Grace cleaned and dressed the wound while Jake fashioned a travois from wagon parts and blankets. The old man stirred, muttering in Spanish, calling for someone named Rosa. "His wife," Pablo explained. "She died last winter. We were going to California, to my uncle's ranch." As Jake secured the travois to his horse, Grace caught his arm. "Thank you." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up at her face. "Don't thank me yet. This might get us all killed." They traveled differently now. Slower, more carefully. Jake walked ahead, leading the horse, while Grace rode with Pablo clutched in front of her. The boy was brave, trying not to cry when the rough terrain jolted his grandfather, but Grace felt him trembling. "Tell me about California," she said softly, trying to distract him. "Uncle Santos has orange trees," Pablo whispered. "So many you can smell them in the morning. And the ocean? Have you seen the ocean, Senora?" "No," Grace admitted. "But I'd like to." "It goes on forever," the boy said. "Like the desert, but blue and moving." Behind them, dust rose on the horizon. Jake saw it too, his pace quickening. They were entering a region of standing rocks, tall sandstone pillars that rose like ancient sentinels. He led them into the maze, following some internal map. Night fell, and still they pushed on. The old man's fever had broken, but he remained unconscious, occasionally crying out. Pablo had fallen asleep against Grace, trusting as only children could be. "There," Jake said finally. "Cave ahead." It was more than a cave, a hidden sanctuary carved by wind and water, with a small spring trickling from the rock. Jake carried the old man inside, while Grace settled Pablo on a bed of sand. "No fire," Jake said. "They're too close." In the darkness, they sat listening to the night sounds, the old man's labored breathing. Coyotes in the distance, and something else. Horses, many horses, moving through the rocks. Jake checked his rifle, his pistols. If they find us, they won't, Grace said with a certainty she didn't feel. You don't know Carson. He's like a bloodhound when he's got a scent. Jake moved to the cave mouth, peering out. Should have left you in that canyon. Should have minded my own business. But you didn't. No, he said softly. I didn't. The horses came closer. Grace could hear voices now. Carson's distinctive growl carrying on the night air. Pablo woke, whimpering, and she pulled him close, covering his mouth gently. Tracks lead this way. Gotta be close. Find that turncoat, son of a... They passed within 50 feet of the cave. Grace held her breath, feeling Jake tense beside her, ready to fight, to die. To protect strangers he'd had every reason to abandon. The voices faded. The hoofbeats grew distant. They waited another hour before Jake finally relaxed. They'll camp tonight. Pick up our trail in the morning, he said. We need to move at first light. Take the high trail through Devil's Backbone. Is it dangerous? Jake's laugh was humorless. Everything out here's dangerous. But it's a path Carson won't expect. Too risky for a wounded man and a child. And a woman. In the darkness, she felt rather than saw him turn toward her. You're not what I expected. Grace Whitman. What did you expect? A preacher's daughter. Soft, helpless, ready to fold at the first sign of trouble. And instead, he was quiet for a moment. Instead, I found someone who walks through hell and still stops to help others. Someone who makes a man remember there might be reasons to be better than he is. The old man stirred, speaking in rapid Spanish. Pablo translated. He says an angel saved him, a beautiful angel with sunrise hair. Tell him it wasn't an angel. Grace said. Tell him it was just someone who understood what it's like to need help. Jake moved back to his watch position. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be harder than today. But Grace couldn't sleep. She sat holding Pablo, watching Jake's silhouette against the cave mouth, thinking about the strange turns that had brought them all to this moment. A preacher's daughter, an outlaw, and two lost souls trying to reach California, united by chance and necessity, bound by something that might have been the beginning of trust. When dawn finally came, painting the rocks in shades of rose and gold. They were already moving. The old man was conscious, weak but alert, thanking them in a mixture of Spanish and broken English. Jake had found a different trail, one that wound up through the rocks like a serpent. They climbed in single file, Jake leading, testing each step, Grace following with Pablo, the travois bumping and scraping behind. Below them, they could see Carson's camp, men and horses scattered among the rocks like toys. Look, Pablo whispered. They seem so small from up here. That's because they are small, Grace said, thinking of all the small, petty people who'd driven her to this moment. Smaller than they know. Jake glanced back at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. Just a slight curve of his lips, but real. Keep moving, philosopher. We've got a long way to go. And they did. But for the first time since leaving Redemption Creek, Grace felt like she might actually make it. Not because the trail was easier or the danger less, but because she'd found something in this harsh land she'd never expected. People worth saving, and someone who thought she was worth saving too. The sun climbed higher, and they climbed with it, leaving Carson and his men behind, carrying their strange fellowship into whatever lay ahead. The gunfire erupted at dawn, shattering the desert silence like broken glass. They'd made camp in a box canyon, Jake's first mistake, born of exhaustion and the need to rest the old man. Carson's gang had found them, surrounding the narrow entrance, cutting off their escape. Get behind those rocks, Jake shouted, already returning fire. His movements were fluid, practiced, deadly. Two men fell before the others scrambled for cover. Grace pulled Pablo and his grandfather behind a large boulder as bullets whined overhead, chips of stone raining down like hail. The old man was conscious but weak, muttering prayers in Spanish. Thornton, Carson's voice echoed off the canyon walls. You've got one chance. Send out the woman and we'll make it quick for you. Jake's answer was another shot that sent Carson diving for cover, but Grace could see their situation. A dozen men at the canyon mouth. Limited ammunition. Nowhere to run. "There's too many," she said when Jake slid behind their boulder to reload. "I know." His face was grim, a cut on his cheek where a rock chip had caught him. "I'm sorry. Grace, I should have—" The attack came from two sides. While Jake faced the main force, 3 men had climbed the canyon walls. Grace saw them just in time, screaming a warning as they opened fire from above. Jake spun, firing upward, but a bullet caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around. He went down hard, gun falling from his hand. "No!" Grace lunged for his fallen pistol, her hands remembering what he'd taught her during their flight. The weapon was heavier than she expected, but she raised it, aimed, and fired. The man on the ridge stumbled, clutched his leg, and fell. Well, Carson called. The preacher's daughter's got some bark after all. Jake was struggling to sit up, his shirt dark with blood. "Grace, take Pablo and run. Back of the canyon. There's a crack in the wall. Might be big enough." "I'm not leaving you." "Damn it, woman. This isn't the time for nobility." But Grace was already tearing strips from her petticoat, pressing them against his wound. Pablo appeared at her side, Jake's rifle in his small hands. "I know how to shoot, senor," the boy said solemnly. "My father taught me." Jake stared at them. This woman who should have been safe in her father's house. This child who should have been playing in orange groves. And something shifted in his gray eyes. "All right," he said quietly. "All right. Pablo, watch the ridge. Grace, help me up." The battle resumed with renewed fury. Jake fought despite his wound, every shot carefully placed. Pablo proved true to his word, the rifle steady in his young hands. Grace reloaded weapons, tended Jake's shoulder, and fired when she could, surprising herself with her steady aim. But they were losing. Their ammunition dwindled. The circle tightened. Then Jake did something that shocked them all. He stood up, fully exposed, and called out, "Carson, you want me? Face me like a man, just you and me." The firing stopped. In the sudden silence, Grace could hear her heart thundering. Carson emerged from cover, disbelief on his scarred face. "You're calling me out? With that shoulder?" "Right hand still works fine." Jake stepped into the open, Grace clutching at him, trying to pull him back. "Unless you're afraid to face me without your pack of dogs." "Jake, no," Grace whispered. He looked down at her, and his expression gentled. "Trust me." Then, louder. "What's it going to be?" "Carson, your men already think you're getting soft, letting me walk away from the gang. You back down now. How long before one of them decides to take your place?" It was masterful manipulation. Grace saw Carson's face darken, saw him glance at his men, reading the calculation in their eyes. "Fine," Carson snarled. "You and me. When I'm done with you, the woman's mine." They faced each other in the morning light. 2 men shaped by violence, defined by it. Grace had seen illustrations of duels in her father's newspapers, but this was different, raw, immediate, final. "Pablo," Jake said quietly, never taking his eyes off Carson. "Whatever happens, you get them out that crack I mentioned. Understand?" "Si, senor." Carson went for his gun first, fast as a striking snake, but Jake was faster, even wounded. His draw was poetry, motion distilled to its essence. 2 shots rang out as one. Carson's bullet tugged at Jake's shirt. Jake's bullet found its mark. Carson stood for a moment, looking surprised, then crumpled to the dust. His men stirred uneasily, leaderless, uncertain. "It's done," Jake called out, swaying slightly but keeping his gun hand steady. "Carson drew first. You all saw it. Fair fight. Anyone else wants to try me, step up. Otherwise, ride out. Find another gang. This one's finished." Boyd emerged from the rocks. "You can't just—" "I can. I am." Jake's voice carried the authority of a man who'd just proven his point in the only currency outlaws understood. "Take Carson's body and go. Any man still here in 5 minutes, I'll consider him declaring for war." One by one, they mounted up. Boyd last, shooting Jake a look of pure venom before spurring his horse. Within minutes, the dust of their departure was settling. Jake's gun fell from nerveless fingers. He dropped to his knees, then forward. Grace caught him, easing him down, his head in her lap. "Jake! Jake! Stay with me!" His eyes fluttered open, focused on her face. "Did they go?" "Yes, they're gone." She pressed harder on his shoulder wound, which had opened again during the fight. "You fool! You magnificent fool! You could have been killed!" "Already was," he murmured. "Minute I decided to save you. Just took a while to realize it." "Don't talk like that." Tears ran down her face, mixing with the dust and gunpowder. "Pablo, bring water and the medical supplies." They worked over him as the sun climbed higher. The wound was bad but clean. The bullet had passed through. Grace cleaned it with the last of their whiskey, while Jake gritted his teeth, his good hand gripping hers hard enough to hurt. "Why?" she asked as she worked. "Why face him like that?" "Because running would never end. Because—" he paused, catching his breath against the pain. "Because I wanted you to see what I was, what I'm trying not to be anymore. I saw a man protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." Jake laughed weakly. "You see too much good in folks, Grace Whitman, and you see too little." She finished binding the wound, helped him sit up against a rock. "Rest now. We'll move when you're stronger." But Jake was looking at her strangely. "That old man, Pablo's grandfather, he was right." "About what?" "You are an angel, sunrise hair and all." His good hand reached up, touched a strand of her auburn hair that had escaped her braid. "Men like me's got no business thinking the thoughts I'm thinking." Grace caught his hand, held it. "What thoughts?" "That maybe redemption isn't just a town's name. That maybe—" He closed his eyes. Whether from pain or emotion, she couldn't tell. "I've done terrible things. Grace, robbed, killed, lived outside every law of God and man. Your father was right to preach against men like me. My father cast out his own daughter for showing mercy." Grace's voice was fierce. "Don't tell me what he was right about." Jake opened his eyes, studied her face. "You know what I am. I know who you are. There's a difference." Old Manuel, Pablo's grandfather, had been watching from his blankets. Now he spoke, Pablo translating. "He says in the desert, water doesn't ask if you deserve to drink. It only gives life to those who thirst." Jake looked at the old man, at Pablo, at Grace. "I've been thirsty a long time," he admitted quietly. "Then drink," Grace said simply. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then Jake lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. It was the gesture of a gentleman, incongruous from a wounded outlaw in a blood-stained shirt, and it made her heart turn over. "We should move," he said finally. Carson's men might change their minds. But as they prepared to leave, Jake leaning heavily on Grace, Pablo leading the way to the hidden exit, Manuel walking slowly but steadily. Grace knew something fundamental had changed, not just the dynamic between them, but something deeper. In trying to save Jake's life, she'd glimpsed his soul, and in that soul, beneath layers of violence and regret, she'd seen something worth saving, something that might, with care and trust and time, learn to save itself. The desert had stripped everything away, her reputation, his defenses, the comfortable lies they'd both lived behind. What remained was truth, raw and painful and precious as water in a wasteland. They emerged from the canyon into a new day, bloodied but alive, bound now by more than circumstance. And if Grace walked a little closer to Jake than strictly necessary for support, if his arm around her shoulders held her a little tighter than his wound required, neither of them mentioned it. Some things were too fragile for words, but in the desert, fragile things that survived often proved the strongest of all. The village of Agua Bendita appeared like a mirage after days of hard travel, a cluster of adobe buildings huddled around a small spring, defying the desert's attempts to erase it. Jake knew the place from his outlaw days, had even robbed a supply wagon heading there once. Now he approached it seeking sanctuary, not plunder. Will they welcome us? Grace asked, noting the suspicious faces peering from windows. They'll welcome my money, Jake said grimly. His shoulder was healing, but slowly, and fever came and went like an unwelcome visitor. The villagers were mostly Mexican farmers and their families, scratching out a living from the unforgiving land. They eyed the newcomers warily until Pablo's grandfather, Manuel, spoke to them in rapid Spanish, explaining their situation. The mention of Jake Thornton caused a ripple of fear, but Grace's gentle manner and obvious care for the wounded man seemed to ease their concerns. They were given shelter in an abandoned adobe at the edge of the village, its walls crumbling but still offering protection from the elements. Grace set about making it livable while Jake recovered, and within days, she transformed the space with borrowed blankets and desert wildflowers. It was on their 4th day that Grace witnessed the tyranny gripping Agua Bendita. A man named Colonel Harrington, though whether he'd ever held military rank was doubtful, controlled the water rights and, through them, the village. His men, a mix of discharged soldiers and hired guns, collected taxes that left families with barely enough to survive. Please, senor, an old woman begged as Harrington's men took most of her corn harvest. My grandchildren, they need food. Should have thought of that before your husband died owing me money, one of the men sneered, dumping out another sack. Grace started forward, but Jake caught her arm. Not yet, he warned. Watch, learn. But watching became impossible when the men turned their attention to a young woman trying to protect her family's meager possessions. As one of Harrington's men grabbed her roughly, Grace wrenched free from Jake's grip. Stop! She stepped between them. You have no right! The man backhanded her casually, sending her sprawling. But before he could follow up, Jake was there, moving despite his injury. His fist connected with the man's jaw with a crack like breaking wood. Nobody touches her, Jake said quietly, dangerously. Nobody. The other men went for their guns, but Jake already had his drawn, steady despite his wounded shoulder. You boys want to dance? I'm Jake Thornton. Maybe you've heard of me. They had. Hands moved away from weapons. Smart choice. Jake helped Grace to her feet, keeping his gun trained on the men. Now get out. Tell Harrington that Agua Bendita is under my protection. After they left, the villagers gathered around, hope and fear warring in their faces. An elderly man named Francisco stepped forward. Senor Thornton, we are grateful, but Colonel Harrington has 20 men. You are one man, wounded. This will bring trouble to our village. Trouble's already here. Jake replied. Question is, do you want to keep living under it, or fight back? With what? Another man asked bitterly. We are farmers, not fighters. You'd be surprised what farmers can do when pushed, Grace said, touching her bruised cheek. My father preached that God helps those who help themselves. Your father sounds wise, Francisco said. Grace's smile was sad. He was. Once. Over the following days, Jake organized the village's defense. He taught the men to shoot with their few ancient rifles, showed them how to use the terrain to their advantage. Grace worked alongside the women, learning their names, their stories, earning their trust with her gentle ways and healing hands. Pablo became their messenger and scout, his small size and quick wit making him ideal for slipping unnoticed through Harrington's patrols. His grandfather, Manuel, proved to have been a soldier in his youth and helped drill the volunteers. You're good at this, Grace told Jake one evening as they watched the men practice. Leading, teaching. Just applying skills learned for bad purposes to better ones. Jake said, though I doubt your father would approve. My father approved of many things that proved wrong. Grace's voice hardened. He preached charity but practiced judgment. Spoke of mercy but showed none. These people show more Christian virtue in their daily struggles than he did from his pulpit. Jake studied her profile in the fading light. You've changed, Grace Whitman. Have I? Or have I finally become who I was meant to be? She turned to him. That night in the canyon, when you asked why I helped Pablo and Manuel, It wasn't just kindness. It was recognition. I saw myself in them, cast out, judged, abandoned. And I saw you seeing the same thing. What else did you see? A man trying to find his way back to himself. A man worth saving. And if I'm not worth saving? Grace reached for his hand. Then we'll be worthless together. But I don't believe that. Not anymore. Their moment was interrupted by Pablo running up. Breathless. Senor Jake, riders coming, many riders. Harrington had come in force, 20 men armed and ready for violence. He rode to the center of the village, arrogant in his power. I hear there's been some confusion about who runs Agua Bendita. He called out, I'm here to clear that up. Thornton, show yourself. Jake emerged from cover, Grace at his side despite his attempts to make her stay back. The villagers gathered behind them, a ragged but determined line. Colonel Harrington, Jake said mockingly. Though I bet you couldn't colonel your way out of a church social. Harrington's face reddened. You're interfering with lawful business. Thornton. Lawful? Grace stepped forward. Stealing food from children, terrorizing families. What law is that? The law of possession. Missy, I own the water rights. Bought them legal from the territory. Show us the papers. Francisco demanded. Don't need to show you nothing, old man. Harrington's hand moved toward his gun. But I'll show you what happens to villages that forget who's in charge. Try it, Jake said softly. See what happens. The tension stretched taut. Then, from the buildings around the square, rifle barrels appeared. Every man in the village who could hold a weapon was at a window or on a roof. Sights trained on Harrington's men. Farmers, Jake said conversationally, who've spent their lives shooting coyotes and rattlesnakes. How many of your men you willing to lose to find out how good their aim is? Harrington's eyes darted around, calculating odds. His men shifted nervously in their saddles. This isn't over, Thornton, he snarled. You can't protect them forever. Don't need forever, just long enough for word to reach the territorial marshal about your forged water rights? Jake smiled coldly. Oh yes, I know they're forged. Had a look at the real documents in the mission archives. Father Miguel was very helpful. It was a bluff. Jake had seen no documents, but Harrington's flinch told everyone it had hit home. You've made a mistake, Harrington said, wheeling his horse. All of you. There'll be a reckoning. After they left, the village erupted in celebration. Music filled the square. Food appeared as if by magic, and Grace found herself pulled into dance after dance by grateful villagers. Jake watched from the shadows, his shoulder preventing him from joining the festivities. But his eyes followed Grace as she laughed and spun, more alive than he'd ever seen her. She brings light, Manuel said, appearing beside him. To you. To us, such women are rare. Too rare for men like me, Jake replied. Perhaps, or perhaps men like you are exactly who such women are meant to save. The old man patted his arm. Do not let the past chain you, senor. The desert teaches us that life finds a way, even in the harshest ground. Later, as the celebration wound down, Grace found Jake sitting alone by the spring. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Thank you, she said, for standing up for them, for teaching them to stand up for themselves. They'll need to keep standing. Harrington will be back. Then we'll be ready. We? Grace looked at him steadily. Did you think I was going somewhere else? My place is here, with these people. She paused. With you. Jake turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, she could see the conflict in his eyes, hope warring with a lifetime of solitude. Grace, She silenced him with a finger to his lips. No more words about worthiness or the past. Tomorrow, Harrington might return. Next week, your old life might catch up. But tonight, we're here. We're alive. That's enough. He caught her hand, held it. How did a preacher's daughter get so wise? By learning that everything I was taught about righteousness was wrong. That true goodness is found in unexpected places. She smiled, like in the heart of an outlaw who risks his life for strangers. Around them, Agua Bendita settled into sleep, peaceful for the first time in months. And by the spring that gave the village its name, Blessed Water, 2 souls who'd been thirsting all their lives finally began to understand what it meant to be satisfied. The news traveled like wildfire across the desert. The preacher's daughter and the notorious outlaw, living openly in Agua Bendita. It reached Redemption Creek within 2 weeks, carried by a traveling merchant who'd recognized Grace at the village well. Reverend Josiah Whitman received the news in his study, the same room where he'd cast out his daughter. The merchant, eager to curry favor with the town's spiritual leader, embellished the tale with salacious details. "Living in sin with that murderer Thornton," the man said, shaking his head. "Bold as brass, walking about like decent folk. It's a scandal, Reverend, a pure scandal." Josiah's hands trembled as he set down his pen. Since Grace had left, he'd aged years in weeks. The congregation whispered about his haggard appearance, his sermons that had lost their fire. Mrs. Holloway had taken to leading prayer meetings, subtly undermining his authority. "My duty is clear," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This abomination cannot stand." The merchant leaned forward eagerly. "The territorial marshal's been looking for Thornton, and there's talk that Colonel Harrington would pay well for information about the man who's been interfering with his business interests." Within days, a twisted coalition formed. Josiah, driven by shame and the need to restore his reputation. The church elders, eager to prove their righteousness. Harrington and his men, thirsting for revenge. And a young marshal named William Bright, ambitious for the glory of capturing Jake Thornton. They descended on Agua Bendita like a biblical plague, 50 men strong, on a Sunday morning when the village had gathered for Mass in the small chapel. Father Miguel had just begun the service when the doors burst open. "In the name of the law," Marshal Bright announced, "we're here for Jake Thornton." Jake, who'd been standing at the back of the chapel, stepped forward. Grace moved with him, but he gently pushed her behind him. "Marshal," Jake said evenly, "I'm not wanted in this territory." "You are now." Bright produced a warrant. 3 counts of murder, robbery, and inciting rebellion against lawful authority. "Whose authority?" Grace demanded. "Colonel Harrington's. He's the real criminal here." That's when she saw him, her father, standing with the church elders behind the marshal. Their eyes met across the chapel, and she saw him flinch. "Father?" Josiah stepped forward, his face a mask of righteous fury that couldn't quite hide the pain beneath. "You are no daughter of mine, but I'll not let you drag others into your degradation. Come back to Redemption Creek. Face judgment." "Perhaps there's still hope for your soul." "My soul?" Grace's voice rose. "You speak of my soul while allying yourself with thieves and murderers? Look around you. Father, these people you call degraded have shown me more of God's love than you ever did." "Blasphemy!" Elder Mills pushed forward. "You see, Reverend, she's beyond redemption, and this devil has corrupted an entire village." Jake had remained silent, but now he spoke. "Take me, Marshal. Leave the village out of it. They're innocent." "No!" Grace gripped his arm. "You're not going anywhere. Grace, I said no!" She turned to face the crowd of accusers. "You want to take him? You'll have to go through me first." What happened next would be debated for years in the territory. Some said Grace stood like an avenging angel. Others claimed it was witchcraft. But all agreed on the basic facts. Grace Whitman, the preacher's daughter who'd been cast out for showing mercy, stood between the law and the man she loved. And when Harrington's men tried to push past her, the villagers rose as one. "You will not take him," Francisco shouted, standing despite his aged bones. "He saved us," a woman cried. "He gave us hope." Even the children stood, forming a protective circle around Jake and Grace. Pablo stepped forward, chin raised defiantly. "Senor Jake is a good man," the boy declared. "Better than any of you." Marshal Bright looked uncertain, his hand hovering near his gun. This wasn't what he'd expected. Women and children defending a notorious outlaw. Harrington, however, had no such qualms. "Enough of this." He drew his weapon. "Stand aside or—" The shot came from outside, then another, and another. Suddenly, the chapel was surrounded by armed men. Not Harrington's or the marshals, but hard-faced riders with the dust of long travel on them. Nobody move. The leader stepped through the door. Boyd, Carson's former lieutenant. Well, Jake Thornton, the man who killed Carson. The man who thinks he can just walk away from the life. Jake pushed Grace behind him again. Boyd, this is between you and me. No, it's between you and the whole gang. What's left of it? Boyd's smile was cold. See, we got to thinking. Carson was holding us back. You did us a favor killing him. But then you had to go and play hero, protecting peasants, pretending to be something you're not. I'm not pretending anymore, Jake said quietly. No? Then you won't mind dying like the dog you are. Boyd raised his gun. Everything happened at once. Jake shoved Grace down as Boyd fired. The bullet meant for Jake's heart caught him in the side instead. Grace screamed. The villagers scattered. Multiple shots rang out as various factions began firing. In the chaos, Jake managed to draw his weapon, returning fire even as blood soaked his shirt. Grace grabbed a fallen pistol, standing over Jake's body, firing at anyone who came close. It was Josiah who stopped it. Enough. The Reverend's voice boomed with the authority of the pulpit. In God's name, enough. Miraculously, the shooting stopped. In the sudden silence, Grace's sobs were the only sound as she pressed her hands against Jake's wounds. Look at us, Josiah continued, his voice breaking. Look what we've become, fighting in a house of God, spilling blood on holy ground. For what? Pride? Vengeance? Gold? He walked slowly through the crowd, past his own church elders, past Harrington's men, past the outlaws. He knelt beside his daughter. Grace, he whispered. My child, what have I done? She looked up at him through tears. You cast me out, Father, for showing mercy. You allied yourself with evil men for your pride. I know. Tears ran down the Reverend's weathered face. God help me, I know. I let them poison my mind. Let shame rule my heart. But seeing you here, protecting this man, standing with these people. He looked around the chapel. You found God in the wilderness, while I lost him in his own house. Jake's eyes fluttered open, focused on Grace. Angel, he murmured. My sunrise angel. Don't talk, Grace whispered. Save your strength. But Jake struggled to sit up, facing the crowd. You want to know what I am? I'll tell you. I'm a sinner, a killer, a thief. Everything you say is true. He coughed, blood speckling his lips. But she saw something else, something worth saving. And these people, they gave me a chance to be better. That's more than any of you righteous folk ever offered. Boyd stepped forward, gun still drawn. Touching speech changes nothing. But Marshal Bright moved between them. It changes everything. I came here to arrest an outlaw, but I see a man who risked his life for innocence, a village willing to die for him. And you, he looked at Boyd with disgust, attacking a church. You're under arrest. You can't arrest all of us, Marshal, one of Boyd's men said. No, but I can make sure you're wanted in every territory from here to California. Bright's voice was steel. Your choice. Ride out now, or face the consequences. Boyd looked around, calculating. The villagers had armed themselves during the chaos. Josiah stood with them now, as did, surprisingly, several of the church elders who'd come from Redemption Creek. The tide had turned. This isn't over, Thornton, Boyd snarled. But he and his men backed out, mounted their horses, and rode away. Harrington tried to follow, but Marshal Bright stopped him. Not you. We need to discuss these water rights I've been hearing about, and the small matter of attempted murder in a church, as Harrington was led away in chains. Josiah helped Grace lift Jake. The parsonage, he said. We'll tend him there. Father, I've been a fool. Grace, a prideful, blind fool. But perhaps it's not too late for redemption. For either of us. They carried Jake to the parsonage, the entire village following. And as Grace worked to save the man she loved, her father beside her, holding bandages and praying, real prayers this time. Not the empty words he'd spoken from his pulpit. She thought that perhaps the town's name hadn't been a cruel joke after all. Sometimes redemption came in unexpected ways. Sometimes it took casting out to truly find one's way home, and sometimes it took an outlaw's love to show a preacher's daughter what grace truly meant. The showdown came at high noon. 3 days after Jake had recovered enough to stand, Boyd and his men had returned, reinforced now with hired guns and desperados drawn by the promise of revenge against the legendary Jake Thornton. They surrounded Agua Bendita like wolves, cutting off water, preventing anyone from leaving or entering. Marshal Bright had departed with Harrington in chains, promising to return with federal troops. But everyone knew help wouldn't arrive in time. The village was on its own. Jake stood in the dusty main street, checking his weapons with methodical care. His wounds had barely closed, and Grace could see the pain in every movement, though he tried to hide it. "You can't face them all," Grace pleaded. "Not in your condition. Don't have much choice." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that had seen too much. "Boyd won't stop until one of us is dead. Better it happens away from the village. Then I'm coming with you." "No." "Yes." Her voice brooked no argument. "We stand together or not at all." Josiah approached them, looking older than his years, but somehow more at peace than Grace had ever seen him. "She's right, Mr. Thornton, and you won't face them alone." Behind him stood Francisco, Pablo, clutching an old rifle nearly as tall as himself, Manuel, and a dozen village men. Even some of the church elders from Redemption Creek had remained, shame and newfound courage warring on their faces. "This isn't your fight, Reverend," Jake said. "That's where you're wrong." Josiah straightened his shoulders. "I spent years preaching about good versus evil from the safety of my pulpit. Time I practiced what I preached." Jake studied the ragtag group of farmers, shopkeepers, and churchmen preparing to face hardened killers. Something shifted in his expression. "All right," he said quietly. "But we do this smart. Boyd expects me to meet him in the street. Trade lead like some dime novel. We're going to disappoint him." They spent the morning preparing. Jake, despite his wounds, directed the defense with the tactical mind that had made him legendary. Barricades appeared at strategic points. Women and children were moved to the sturdy mission. Every approach was covered. At noon, Boyd rode in with 20 men, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. He stopped in the center of the street, exactly where Jake had predicted. "Thornton," Boyd's voice echoed off the adobe walls. "Time to finish this. You wanted to play hero? Come die like one." Jake emerged from cover, but not alone. Grace walked beside him, her father on the other side. Behind them came the defenders of Agua Bendita, a line of unlikely warriors united by something stronger than fear. "That's close enough, Boyd," Jake called. "State your business and ride on." Boyd laughed. "My business? You killed Carson, turned your back on the Brotherhood, made us look weak. My business is putting you in the ground. Carson called me out. Fair fight. As for the Brotherhood," Jake's voice carried clear and strong, "I found a better one. People who stand for something more than greed and blood. Pretty words from a killer. Yes, I'm a killer." Jake stepped forward. "I've done things that will haunt me to my grave, but these people showed me another way, a better way. And if you want them, you'll have to go through me." "Gladly." Boyd drew his gun, but before he could fire, Grace moved, not away from danger, but toward it. She stepped in front of Jake, arms spread wide, facing Boyd and his men without flinching. "No!" Jake tried to pull her back, but she stood firm. "You want to kill him?" Her voice rang out clear as a bell. "Then kill me first, because that's what you'll have to do. Grace, please." Jake's voice cracked. She half turned to him, smiling through tears. "You lifted my face when the world cast me down. You cleared my name when everyone believed lies. Now let me stand for you." Boyd's gun wavered. "Get out of the way, woman." "No." Josiah stepped forward, standing beside his daughter. "You'll have to kill me too. I failed my daughter once. Not again. And me," Francisco added, joining them. "And me." Pablo darted forward before anyone could stop him, one by one. The villagers formed a human shield around Jake. Men, women, even children who slipped past their guardians. They stood silent, defiant, daring Boyd's men to gun down innocents. Boyd's face contorted with rage. "This is insane. Move, all of you." "They won't," Jake said quietly. He gently but firmly moved Grace aside and stepped forward. "Because they're better than us, Boyd, better than what we became. But maybe we don't have to stay what we are. Spare me the redemption speech." But Boyd's voice lacked conviction. Some of his men were shifting uneasily, guns lowering. Killing Jake Thornton in a gunfight was one thing. Massacring an entire village of innocents was another. "Look around you," Jake continued. "Look at what we're about to do. Gun down farmers, murder children? For what? Because I chose to change? Because I found something worth protecting?" He spread his arms wide, leaving himself completely vulnerable. "If that's a crime worthy of death, then shoot. But look these people in the eye when you do it. Look at her." He pointed to Grace. "Tell her why the man she loves has to die. Tell that boy why his hero deserves a bullet. Tell this preacher why protecting his daughter demands bloodshed." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Boyd's men exchanged glances, uncertainty spreading through their ranks like wildfire. "This is what we are now," one of them muttered. "Child killers." "Shut up," Boyd snarled. But the damage was done. The spell of violence was breaking. Jake took another step forward. "It doesn't have to be this way. Boyd, Carson's dead. The old gang is finished. You could ride away, start fresh somewhere. We all could." "You think it's that easy? Just decide to be different?" "No," Grace said, stepping beside Jake again. "It's the hardest thing in the world, but it's possible. I've seen it. A man everyone called a monster chose mercy. A father who cast out his daughter found forgiveness. A village of strangers became a family. If they can change, anyone can." Boyd's gun shook. For a moment, humanity flickered in his eyes, a glimpse of who he might have been, might still become. Then one of his men, younger and hungrier for blood, raised his rifle. "If you won't do it, I will!" The shot rang out. Jake moved without thinking, shoving Grace aside, spinning to face the threat, but the bullet never reached them. Pablo's grandfather, Manuel, stepped into its path. The old soldier who'd survived so much crumpled to the dust, a red stain spreading across his chest. "Grandfather!" Pablo's scream tore through the air. What followed wasn't a gunfight. It was a reckoning. The villagers, enraged by the senseless killing of an old man, surged forward. Some of Boyd's men threw down their weapons rather than fire on the crowd. Others tried to fight and found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers and righteous fury. Jake reached the shooter first, disarming him with brutal efficiency. But instead of killing him, he held the young man down, forcing him to look at what he'd done. "See him?" Jake's voice was terrible in its controlled rage. "His name was Manuel Vasquez. He survived war, poverty, desert, and disease to die for nothing. For your pride. Look at him." The young outlaw broke, sobbing. Around them, the fight was ending. Boyd's men were surrendering or fleeing. Boyd himself stood frozen, gun forgotten in his hand, watching his power crumble. Grace knelt beside Manuel, cradling his head. The old man's eyes found hers, peaceful despite the pain. "No tears, me angel," he whispered. "I die as I lived, protecting what matters." Pablo clutched his grandfather's hand, beyond tears. Manuel smiled at him. "Be strong, mijo, be like them, better than we were." As Manuel's eyes closed for the last time, Josiah began to pray, not the empty words of his former sermons, but a real prayer, raw with grief and hope. Others joined him, their voices rising in an impromptu funeral hymn. Boyd looked around at the scene, his men defeated or fled. A community, united in mourning. The man he'd come to kill standing unafraid. The gun fell from his nerveless fingers. "It's over," he said hollowly. "Carson, the gang, all of it, over. It doesn't have to be your end too." Jake said, "Right away. Boyd, find somewhere new. Become someone else. If I could do it." Boyd laughed bitterly. "You had her." He looked at Grace. "You had something to change for. What do I have?" "A choice," Grace said simply. "That's all any of us have. A choice to be better than we were yesterday." Boyd stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back. His remaining men followed, leaving Agua Bendita in peace at last. As the dust settled, Jake and Grace stood together over Manuel's body. The village gathered around them, united in grief but also in victory. They had faced down evil not with violence but with courage, not with guns but with love. "He was wrong, you know," Jake said quietly. "Boyd, about having something to change for." "Oh?" Jake looked down at her. This woman who'd stood between him and death, who'd seen past the outlaw to the man beneath. "I didn't change for you, Grace. I changed because of you, because you showed me it was possible, because you believed I was worth saving even when I didn't." Josiah approached them, his face wet with tears. "Mr. Thornton, Jake, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you my daughter's life, and my soul. You owe me nothing, Reverend. I owe you everything." Josiah straightened. "Which is why I want to perform a ceremony, if you'll have me. And if my daughter will forgive me enough to let me give her away properly this time." Grace looked between her father and Jake, understanding dawning. "Father, are you saying—" "I'm saying I'd be honored to bless a union between two people who've taught me more about God's grace than all my years in the pulpit." He managed a wan smile. "Though we'll have to do something about that wanted poster first." Jake was staring at Grace. Would you?" She lifted her hand to his scarred face. "Jake Thornton, is that a proposal?" "It's whatever you want it to be. I'd marry you here in the dust if you'd have me. Grace Whitman, you saved my soul. Would you take what's left of my life and make it yours?" "Only if you take mine in return," she whispered. As they kissed there in the street, surrounded by a village that had become family, with her father's blessing and Manuel's sacrifice sanctifying the ground beneath their feet, the words that had begun their journey echoed with new meaning. The preacher's daughter had been cast out, but found her true home. The bandit had lifted her face, and in doing so, lifted his own soul from darkness, and in clearing her name, he'd cleared his own path to redemption. Sometimes the greatest love stories were written not in comfort and ease, but in blood and dust and sacrifice. And sometimes, just sometimes, they ended not with death but with the promise of a new beginning. The truth has a way of traveling faster than horses in the desert. Within weeks, the story of Agua Bendita had spread throughout the territory, how a preacher's daughter and a notorious outlaw had stood together against tyranny, how a village of farmers had faced down killers, how an old Mexican soldier had given his life for peace. Marshal Bright returned with federal investigators who uncovered the full extent of Harrington's corruption, the forged water rights, the intimidation, the theft disguised as taxation. It all came to light, with Harrington imprisoned and his false claim invalidated. Agua Bendita's water belonged to its people once more. More surprisingly, testimonies from the villagers and even some of Boyd's captured men painted a different picture of Jake Thornton than the wanted posters suggested. Yes, he'd robbed banks and stages, but many of his victims had been corrupt officials and businessmen who'd grown rich on others' misery. Yes, he'd killed, but in fair fights or self-defense, never the innocent. "Sometimes," Marshal Bright told the federal judge, "the law and justice aren't the same thing. This man chose justice." The judge, a fair-minded woman named Henrietta Stone, who'd fought her own battles for recognition in a man's profession, reviewed the case with unusual thoroughness. In the end, she issued a landmark ruling. Jake Thornton's past crimes were pardoned in recognition of his service to the community and the territory. "Let it be known," she declared, "that redemption is possible for those who truly seek it. Jake Thornton is a free man." But freedom, Jake was learning, came with its own challenges. He stood at the edge of Agua Bendita as the sun set, looking out at the desert that had been both prison and sanctuary. Grace found him there, as he knew she would. "Second thoughts?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "About marrying you?" "Never." He pulled her close. "About whether I deserve this second chance? Always." "Deserving has nothing to do with it," Grace said firmly. "Love isn't earned. Jake, it's given, freely, completely, without conditions." "Your father said something similar in his sermon last Sunday." Josiah had stayed in Agua Bendita, finding in the small village church a peace that had eluded him in Redemption Creek's grand but hollow building. His sermons now spoke of mercy over judgment, understanding over condemnation. The man who'd cast out his daughter had become her fiercest protector and Jake's unexpected friend. "My father's learned a lot," Grace said. "We all have." The wedding took place in the village square. Under stars that seemed to shine with special brilliance, the whole village attended, along with unexpected guests. Some of Jake's old gang members, the ones who'd chosen Boyd's path of redemption, came to wish him well. Mrs. Holloway and several citizens from Redemption Creek made the journey, shamefaced but sincere in their apologies. "I was wrong, Mrs. Holloway told Grace, tears in her eyes. "We all were. Can you forgive us?" "I forgave you long ago," Grace replied. "Holding on to anger would have poisoned me worse than your judgment ever could." Pablo served as ring bearer, solemn with the importance of his role. The rings themselves were simple bands Jake had fashioned from melted coins, symbols of transformation, of base metal made precious through fire and intention. When Josiah asked who gave this woman to be married, Francisco stepped forward. "Her village family does," he said proudly, "with love and blessing." The ceremony was simple but profound. Josiah spoke of paths through wilderness, of finding God in unexpected places, of love that transformed sinners into saints. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up could be heard for miles. "You may kiss your bride," Josiah said, smiling through his tears. Jake cupped Grace's face in his hands, looking at her with wonder. "The preacher's daughter," he murmured. "The bandit's wife," she whispered back. Their kiss was gentle, a promise of all the tomorrows they'd face together. The celebration lasted until dawn, with music and dancing and stories shared around bonfires. Jake and Grace slipped away as the first light touched the eastern mountains, walking hand in hand to the small adobe that would be their home. "Do you want to leave?" Jake asked as they stood in their doorway. "California's still there, ocean and orange trees. Like Pablo promised, we could start completely fresh." Grace looked out at Agua Bendita, at the church where her father had found his true calling, at the square where a community had stood together, at the graves where Manuel and others lay, having given everything for what they believed in. "We are starting fresh," she said. "Right here. These people are our family now. This is our home." A former outlaw and a cast-out preacher's daughter, making a life in a desert village. Jake smiled. Not quite the fairy tale ending. "No," Grace agreed, turning in his arms. "It's better. It's real." As the sun rose over Agua Bendita, painting the adobe walls gold, they closed the door on their past and opened it to their future. In the distance, a roadrunner called, and the desert bloomed with the brief, precious flowers that followed rain. Months later, when Grace told Jake about the new life growing within her, he wept for the first time she'd ever seen. "I don't know how to be a father," he confessed. "You didn't know how to be a hero either," she reminded him, "but you learned." Their daughter was born as the century turned, a child of two worlds, raised on stories of redemption and courage, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She grew up in a village where Mexican and Anglo, former outlaws and preachers' daughters, All lived as neighbors and friends. Jake never returned to his old life, though occasionally men from his past would drift through Agua Bendita. Some came seeking revenge and found instead a man at peace, unwilling to be drawn back into violence. Others came broken and lost, and found what Jake had found, a chance to begin again. "How did you do it?" one former outlaw asked. "How did you change?" Jake looked across the square to where Grace was teaching the village children, her hair still catching the light like copper fire. "I met someone who saw me, not as I was, but as I could be, and I decided to try to become the man she saw." Josiah lived to hold his grandchildren, preaching until the end about the mysterious ways of grace. On his deathbed, he took Jake's hand. "You saved my daughter," he whispered. "But more than that, you saved me. You showed me what I'd forgotten, that God's love is wild and free as the desert wind, finding its way into the most unexpected hearts." Years passed. The railroad came through, bringing change and challenge. Jake served as sheriff, using his knowledge of the outlaw mind to keep the peace. Grace became the territorial advocate for education, ensuring every child had the chance to read and write and dream. But their greatest accomplishment was simpler. They loved each other, fiercely and faithfully, through drought and plenty, sickness and health. They raised their children to be brave and kind. They turned a house into a home and a village into a community where anyone could find sanctuary. Sometimes, in the evening, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the desert. Grace would lean against Jake's shoulder, and he would tell their children the story. How a preacher's daughter was cast out for showing mercy. How a bandit lifted her face and cleared her name. How love found a way to bloom even in the harshest ground. "Is it true?" the youngest would always ask. "Every word, every word," Jake would assure them. Sometimes the most impossible stories are the truest ones. And in the great book of the West, where so many tales ended in violence and loss, theirs stood as testimony to a different possibility, that redemption was real, that love could transform, that sometimes the cast out found their way home, not by returning to where they started, but by creating something new and beautiful in the wilderness. The preacher's daughter and the bandit, cast out and lifted up, condemned and redeemed, proof that in the wild heart of America, where anything could happen, sometimes what happened was grace. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love and redemption in the Old West. I hope Grace and Jake's journey touched your heart as it did mine. Please comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening to this tale. I love connecting with listeners from all corners of the globe. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories of courage, romance, and adventure from America's frontier days. Share your thoughts about Grace and Jake's story in the comments. What moment moved you most? Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own sunset,